Right, kia ora koutou, good afternoon. I'll start with the latest numbers, which have just been released by the Ministry of Health. There are 4 new COVID-19 cases to report in New Zealand today. 2 are community cases linked to the Auckland August cluster, and 2 are imported cases that have been picked up in our managed isolation facilities. Of the imported cases, one is a man in his 30s and the other is a woman in her 50s. Both cases arrived in New Zealand on the 27th of August. They are in managed isolation, or were in managed isolation in Christchurch. They tested positive on day 12 testing, and both cases are now in quarantine. Of our 2 community cases, both have epidemiological links to the existing cases in the bereavement subcluster that links back to the Mount Roskill Evangelical Fellowship group. There are now 72 people linked to the community cluster who remain in the Auckland quarantine facility, which includes 56 people who have tested positive for COVID-19 and their associated household contacts. Since August the 11th, our contact tracing team has identified 3,372 close contacts of cases. Of those, 3,354 have been contacted and are self-isolating, and we're in the process of contacting the rest. With today's 4 new cases and the 9 additional recovered cases that we're reporting today, our total number of active cases is now 120. Of those, 39 are imported cases in managed isolation and quarantine facilities, and 81 are community cases. Yesterday, the labs processed 7,950 tests for COVID-19, bringing the total number of tests completed to date to 839,467. We're moving as rapidly as we can to contain the latest mini cluster. I want to reinforce again that what has set us apart from other countries is our willingness to muck in and work together, both to beat this virus and, of course, to look after each other. Many other countries look enviously upon New Zealand and the way that we've pulled together in these tough times and the success that we have achieved from that collective approach. We've got many freedoms that those countries can only dream about. And we'll have more quickly the sooner we shut this particular cluster down. As always, we cannot be complacent in the way that we think about and we respond to COVID-19. We've all got a part to play to keep ourselves and to keep others safe. This virus is real and it's deadly, but if we follow the rules and do the basics, we can get back to as close to normal as possible. What continues to be troubling and is threatening to block our path to level 1 is repeated, deliberate and malicious spreading of misinformation. We're continuing to see organised campaigns that are designed to confuse and to sow doubt about our response. Everybody has a right to be sceptical in their own and hold their own views, but equally everybody has a right to be safe. So please think twice before sharing or passing on something that you cannot verify. Even better, we can all play our part in drowning out misinformation by sharing the right information, by engaging, encouraging and educating, by being kind and supportive and having good conversations both in person and online. Pacifica and Māori public health officials and community leaders are standing firmly alongside the leaders and the members of the Mount Roskill Evangelical Fellowship. Police have been on hand to provide additional support where necessary. These strong relationships and regular communications are critical to building trust, and we are seeing excellent cooperation on the whole. The communication channels are open and two-way, and they're working well. I'm informed that church leaders are actively encouraging all of their members of the congregation to retest by Friday and to comply with other public health requirements such as self-isolation. As a result of this cooperation, by 8 o'clock this morning, labs had registered new tests for 64% of the congregation. That's 213 of the 332 people. There are 101 close contacts associated with this subcluster. Public health officials make daily phone calls to all of those close contacts to conduct symptom checks, and the teams engaged in these checks are reporting that there is a high degree of compliance with the requirements to self-isolate. Auckland Public Health has good testing coverage, and is only needed to set up one additional testing site in Mount Roskill. It's located at the Mount Roskill War Memorial, and it's open from 9 a.m. to 4 p.m. There are also pop-up testing stations that can move to new locations every couple of days to respond to community need and to keep our testing numbers up. With regard to St Dominic's, the school deep clean has been completed and the testing of all staff and students is underway. Many members of the school community have been tested since they were informed of the case on Tuesday afternoon. Testers have been supplied with a particular code so that we can keep track of all those from that school who have been tested. And as at 11 o'clock today, labs have registered 561 tests against that code, bearing in mind that not everybody from St Dominic's who's been tested might have been recorded against that code, so it may be slightly under-reporting those test results. That's still quite a good number. Staff and students have been provided with 2 dedicated testing centres that aren't open to the general public. That means that they can be tested more quickly, and though the test results with that code will be prioritised for processing. Close contacts have been advised they need to stay in self-isolation for 14 days, even if their test result is negative. Those who are not identified as close contacts do not need to self-isolate while they wait for the test result. What we continue to see around the Auckland-August cluster, and in general, is that when people who test positive for COVID-19 can be specific about their contacts and their movements, this dramatically speeds up the contact tracing process, which in turn limits the spread of the virus. So it's good to see that the app has now recorded 2,171,700 registered users, and the number of poster scans and manual entries has exceeded 50 million. So combined, that's all good news. And I'm now happy to answer your questions.
How long do you think the subcluster and all these new cases, how long do you think that's pushed back for the one?
We are likely to see more positive cases out of this new subcluster, but it would appear that we have managed to get it early, which means that at this point we're not seeing any other cases popping up associated with the subcluster that aren't already identified contacts. So that's good news. So we will see some more positive cases, but again, as I've gone through before, when we look at the alert levels and changes to the alert levels, one of the questions we always ask is, are the new cases popping up all connected? Are they people who were known contacts? Are they in isolation? And thus far, with the subcluster, that's looking quite promising.
Recent cases, say for the past week, outside of imported cases, they're all subcluster cases, aren't they?
They are all subcluster, or they're all linked. They're all associated with one another. I think what I've mentioned before, though, is that there was one sort of undisclosed chain of transmission that caused this latest subcluster to emerge. And of course, we've been working very hard to make sure we chase all of that down as quickly as possible.
I think then alert level 1 might be on the cards for September, after September 16th.
Look, that's a decision for next week. It's not a decision that we're making today.
We've been told that members of the Mount Roskill Evangelical Church were involved in an anti-lockdown protest outside a countdown in alert level 3. Can you confirm that? That's
not something that I have any detailed information on, and so it's not been verified or reported to me in any verifiable way.
How many members of that church have been asked to be retested and how many have agreed to be tested?
So I think I just went through those numbers and I've got them again here. So there are 332 people in the congregation that needed to be tested, and 213 of them have now been retested, so tested at least twice as of 8 o'clock this morning.
If there's a positive case, what will that mean for our chances to move to level 1?
If they're in isolation, so they're people who had already been identified as at-risk contacts, it probably wouldn't change things very much.
Of the people, and sorry if you've covered this in recent days, but of the new cases this week, how many were not in isolation already?
So there was, if I could put it this way, there was one chain of transmission, if you like, that was a missing link that we saw, and that was associated with the bereavement, where there was some contact between people in the Mount Roskill cluster with people that are now part of this new subcluster. And that was something that we previously did not know about. That new subcluster is being got on top of very quickly. So the new cases that we're seeing today were people who were already identified close contacts, already in isolation.
What about in previous days, say in this past week? the new subclusters, so they weren't already in isolation?
Some of them were, but it would be literally a matter of sort of 24 hours after they were identified that they tested positive because of the way the contact tracing system works. So as soon as they're identified as a close contact, we're generally getting hold of them very, very quickly. They're then isolating, they're then being tested, and that's where we're seeing most of this week's cases are coming through that process.
You don't have numbers in front of you now that says in the past week there have been X cases and X number were already...
No, but we can certainly work out that breakdown for you. I'm happy to get you that.
People linked to this cluster thinking that COVID-19 isn't as dangerous as it is, and you saying here that it's misinformation that they're spreading. They see that as you, I guess, trying to shut down what they say is the truth. How do you break through that?
Look, I think we do need to accept the science. We do need to just watch the TV news and look at what's happening internationally and whether the countries where COVID-19's gotten out of control, where deaths are a daily occurrence. We're very fortunate in New Zealand that because of the collective efforts that we've taken, we're not seeing that in New Zealand. What that means, though, is that some people are becoming more sceptical as time goes on. The reality, though, is just look at what's happening internationally. You can see that this is very, very real. The virus is very, very deadly. There is no vaccine for it, so people can't protect themselves from it. The best protection that we all have is through our collective efforts to give the virus nowhere to go.
Are you looking at any sanctions or punishment for people from the church who defied lockdown rules?
But one of the most important things for us, the most important thing for us in this whole exercise is to get people cooperating, to get people sharing information. And one of the risks of a punitive approach is that people will stop cooperating and stop sharing information right at the time when we desperately need them to. So no, we're not talking about taking a punitive approach, because we need people to be coming forward. And the last thing that I would want is someone sitting there thinking, goodness me, I'm in a bit of trouble here. I'm going to stop talking and I'm going to stop sharing information because I don't want to get into more trouble. The reality is the virus is the problem, not the people. The people are the answer, something that we've repeated over and over again now. So my advice to people is come forward if you've got concerns. Get a test if you're worried. There won't be a punitive approach here because we need everybody to play their part.
Taking a punitive approach with people sharing the misinformation?
Look, that's much more difficult, and I guess all New Zealanders can play a leadership role here in just not sharing that misinformation.
Are there any criminal offences, though, to the best of your knowledge, that law enforcement agencies could look to apply or charge people for in those cases where you've got recidivist offenders potentially who are repeatedly sharing misinformation?
Look, that's not something that that I have looked at. It is something that we may look at if it continues to go on and it continues to become more and more of a problem. My message to all New Zealanders is, though, we can give the misinformation nowhere to go, just as we're giving the virus nowhere to go. If people don't stand for it, they don't tolerate it, they don't share it, then actually that's the best safeguard that we could possibly have.
The ministry established if the church not disclosing the student close contact who since tested positive, whether that was deliberate or not? So
it wasn't the student. The student was a contact of the undisclosed contact. So there's every day when the investigation process reveals a bit more information, we see some new pieces of the puzzle. So what's become clear over the last 24 hours is that the student was a contact of someone who was a contact that had previously been undisclosed, if that makes sense. The key focus of the investigation is on making sure that all the contacts are identified. Part of that investigation process then looks to whether or not how the link in the chain got missed. So was it deliberate? Was it just inadvertent? I haven't had the results of that yet. Of course, because the reason that bit takes a bit longer is the first and the primary focus is the contact tracing. So it's identifying, okay, we've now got some more information. What does that tell us? What new cases do we need to follow up on? Do that first, then worry about where the system fell down. So, and it might not necessarily be the system falling down. It might have been that there was, the information just wasn't supplied.
Is it important for you to know whether it was delivered or not, or is it by the by?
It's useful to know, but what's most important to know is what the new information tells us. So we now know that we've got this new subcluster. So let's get on top of it as quickly as we can.
Does at school attendance in Auckland, how concerning are the latest statistics?
What we saw the last time we were at level 2 is that we did see quite a significant lag time between moving to level 2 and student attendance going back up. And we didn't see full attendance or a fuller attendance picture emerge until we got to level 1. I do understand that parents are anxious, but as I've said repeatedly, schools are safe places to be. We would not be reopening schools in the way we are if we were concerned that they weren't safe. So parents should be sending their kids back to school. The people who are being punished by them not being in school are the kids themselves, because they're missing out on valuable learning time. Particularly if you look at those senior secondary school students where they've got exams coming up, they've lost effectively a term's worth of their learning or their in-classroom time. Schools are doing everything they can to help those young people catch up, but that relies on those young people being there for that learning to take place. So my very clear message to parents is please send your kids back to school. Now is the time for them to be re-engaging in their learning.
That message is not getting through?
Look, I do accept that there's still some reluctance by some parents to send their kids back to school. We'll continue to push the message as quickly and as strongly as we can that now is the time for kids to be back in school. It's safe for kids to be back at school, and it's their learning that's being put back by them not being in school.
Do more than just pushing the message, though?
Again, I don't want to distract everyone's attention with a more punitive approach. We have allocated quite a lot of money, though, to the immediate or urgent response from the school sector, which includes more money for the attendance services where that's appropriate, and the Ministry of Education are working there to scale those systems up if we need to. But again, my first preference is that parents gain that confidence, send their kids back to school, really fully support them being back in school so they can get on with their learning.
There's a video online of a man in managed isolation talking to people through a fence without a mask on. Are you aware of this, and what measures are in place to stop this sort of thing?
No, I haven't. I'm not aware of that, but I do know that those sorts of things are investigated where they become apparent. That they are. That obviously falls within the purview of Air Commodore Webb and Megan Woods, who run the managed isolation and quarantine facilities. I do know they investigate those sorts of things. I do just want to be clear here again. Around the masks, it would very much depend on the circumstances as to whether or not a mask was required to be worn. I don't know who the person was who's having the conversation on either side of the fence and what their circumstances are. So it's difficult to comment on those sorts of situations without knowing the details of them.
Can you clarify the size of this subcluster? Because it was a little, just yesterday the update was 14 and then that was later revised to 22. So is it now 24 and then the Mount Roskill group is
Let me
45?
see if I've got that exact number for you so that I can give you the most up-to-date number around the. I have got it. Look, I'll give it to you straight after this. I don't want to read out the wrong number, so I'll give it to you straight after this just to make sure I get the absolute right number.
Is New Zealand in talks with Hong Kong about a potential travel bubble?
Not that I'm aware of. Not MFAT are obviously continuing to talk to different countries around travel arrangements generally. That's not a conversation I've been involved with. It's not one that's come to a ministerial level at this point, if there is such a conversation happening.
It's taken the government months to allow school-aged children from overseas to go to school here.
There's some complexity that we had to work our way through. One of them is just making sure that we're geared up to support those young people. Many of them will have English as a second language, for example. I guess the other thing that's become very clear to us is that the ability for those young people to return home may be constrained for quite a long period of time. And so, we're always reviewing that. We're always looking at what more we can do. And this is a relatively pragmatic solution for those young people so that they can continue their learning while they're here in New Zealand.
Out of school for months, is that good enough?
Look, COVID-19's created a lot of disruption for a lot of people. We've been working as quickly as we can to identify groups that need that extra support. This is a group who frankly, we would have expected to have left the country by now. They haven't, they can't, and so we're providing them with that extra level of support.
How many children is it exactly, and how will they get to these schools? And how will they?
They're not huge numbers. It's from memory, it's below 2,000, but I can give you the exact number of students that are involved, and we've got a bit of a breakdown available too of which countries that they're coming from. They're spread all over. There's quite a few from the Pacific, from different Asian countries, handful from further afield, but we can get you the exact breakdown of the demographics of them too.
Be able to go to school next year as well? Will you consider extending?
Haven't made that decision yet. A lot will hinge on when does travel start to resume, and bearing in mind that travel may start to resume even before restrictions are eased, but at the moment travel is very, very limited. The number of flights coming in and out is very, very small.
Looking ahead, what are your thoughts on having sort of lockdown restrictions in certain suburbs or perhaps certain parts of Auckland?
So the Melbourne-style lockdowns didn't work in Melbourne. They resulted in a protracted and prolonged level 4 style lockdown, and a similar approach in New Zealand would likely have the same kind of result. So if you look at this most recent, the August cluster that we're dealing with in Auckland, it is spread all over Auckland, north, south, east, west. If we had said we're just going to try and isolate to the community that was initially identified and draw a ring around that and say we'll lock down that area only, we would have missed a whole lot of cases that popped up around the rest of Auckland, and therefore we would potentially be in a Melbourne-style situation by now. So our regionalised approach, I think, is about as small as you can get, and a more localised approach than that, I think, would be very dangerous and potentially would allow the virus to get out of control, and that's exactly what happened in Melbourne, and we don't want to repeat that mistake.
Can you clarify?
We'll come back down here.
Are you aware of the Director General of Health or any government departments being given proposals for the hosting of the Rugby Championship by New Zealand Rugby, and were any of these acceptable in health terms to you?
Yes, and I have provided some feedback and some input into that process. I'm not in a position to make any announcements on that today. That currently sits with other ministers, but certainly there have been some very good and productive discussions.
And would that see teams quarantining in, say, the likes of Queenstown, or how would that work? Can you give any further details around that?
One of the tests for New Zealand, of course, would be in any such arrangements, are the quarantine arrangements sufficiently robust that they are meeting at least as good a standard as our current managed isolation and quarantine facilities. And so that's the capacity in which I get consulted as Minister of Health. And ultimately, I'll be one of the ministers that would have to sign off on any final arrangement before the go button was pressed on that.
Have you got a timeline on when that might happen?
No, I haven't got a fixed timeline to give to you today.
Can you clarify, can the election happen under level 2.5?
Yes, the election is designed to happen at a level 2-like environment. The 2.5, so the 0.5 type, which is an informal classification, are not the sort of extra restrictions that would necessarily affect an election campaign. So the way the Electoral Commission have organised the voting, it's over a long period of time. There's a much larger number of advanced polling places open for that 2 and a bit week period before election day, on the basis that we actually expect most people will vote spread out over that 2-week period rather than the big surge on the last day. So that's what the Electoral Commission will be encouraging, in fact, is actually people to spread their voting out so that you don't have those big, long queues on election day.
Person who was infectious, who visited the bereavement event, what advice were they given? Were they not self-isolating at the time?
So my understanding, and again this is one of the things that the investigation looks at, was that they were either on their way to get the test or they had had the test and were awaiting the result of the test. So I haven't got any more detail beyond that. The timing suggests that it was all right at about the same time. So, of course, we'll get more information on that in due course.
Just back to the testing at for the Mount Roskill church group, what involvement have police had in getting that church to cooperate?
So the police have very good links in the community, and they have been helping with helping the Auckland Regional Public Health Service, who have been out there trying to generate cooperation, bearing in mind that a punitive approach is likely to have the opposite effect to the one that we want. We want people cooperating. We don't want them to be scared away by thinking we're taking a punitive approach. But also having the police involved, I mean, I guess it does two things. One is it just reminds everyone this is pretty serious, but it also draws on the really good positive links that the police have with the local communities.
What are your thoughts on the compliance with isolation and social distancing? We've had that August 15 meeting, which the pre-meeting the police had to break up. We've got the the exposure event for the subcluster on August 27, where it was a home visit to a bereaved family, which may have been outside of the level 3 rules, and we have the person there who infected people, who got the virus from someone who should have been isolating as a close contact.
Yeah. So that we are monitoring people's compliance with the isolation requirements quite stringently, probably more so than normal. That includes the daily phone calls. It is including some home visits as well to check that people are complying. Those visits are being conducted by Health to make sure that people are complying. So the feedback that I've had so far is that we're getting a very, very good rate of compliance. People are doing what they are being asked to do.
The Rugby Championship, you said the arrangements would need to be at least as good as MRQ facilities. So would individual team members be required to stay separated for the duration of that 14 days?
So that is one of the things that obviously we're working through. They need to be able to keep training during their isolation period. And so what sort of bubble arrangements you would put around that is one of the detailed things that are currently being worked through, which would be involving the health professionals to make sure that that's as robust as possible. And of course, the teams themselves in that situation would be doing everything they can to ensure that everybody gets negative tests, because if you had a larger bubble, for example, within your isolation or quarantine arrangement, and one person tested positive, that's going to have an impact for everybody in that bubble. So there is a good degree of goodwill, but there's just a lot to work through. And our teams are working as quickly as they can to work through all of those details.
The quarantine powers under the Health Act in relation to non-compliance here, if you're suspecting someone who might have COVID and they're reluctant to get a test, or you think they might go and meet someone where they shouldn't meet, those kinds of things.
That is an option, and I certainly would never discount that as being something that we may do in the future. But one of the things that I've also said is, we actually need people to willingly comply here, to share information, because that's how we get on top of the subcluster much faster. If people are willingly sharing information, that is far preferable to a punitive approach. But the last thing we want is people to shut down and sort of resort to their Miranda rights. We actually want them to be sharing information with us.
Question. There was a lot of releases yesterday around the immigration policies and relaxing the borders for people coming in on partnership visas for visa waiver countries. Where are you at with potentially opening it up to all countries to have those visas being looked at and those applications being looked at?
Look, that's something that's being handled by immigration. It's not something that I'm intricately involved with, but I'm sure we can get you an answer to where they're at in terms of the process.
Are you considering any further restrictions on flights coming in from India, given that we now have 28 positive cases coming from there, and obviously caseloads there spiralling?
So all of the people who would be coming in would be people who are eligible to enter New Zealand, so returning residents and citizens. And we've always been very clear that actually New Zealanders do have a right to return home, and we'll do everything we can to support them to return home whilst keeping other New Zealanders safe, and that's what the managed isolation quarantine process is designed to achieve. It would be wrong for New Zealand to say, because of where you happened to be in the world at the time this all kicked off, that you would be prevented from coming home to New Zealand, whilst people in other parts would be allowed to come home. Actually, New Zealanders should be allowed to come home.
Working with any of the church elders yourself to try and clarify information?
No, I haven't, but my ministerial colleagues have been engaged in that process. So Opito Williams-Seo, Penny Hinari and Jenny Salesa up in Auckland, good contacts with the church. They have been engaging with the church community leaders on behalf of the government, and my understanding is that those have been very positive conversations.
Your concerns about misinformation, are they less now?
Look, I'm always concerned about misinformation, but in terms of that church, the feedback I have had is that we are getting a really good degree of cooperation, and that's something that I absolutely welcome.
About the retesting?
Not from what we've seen, and I think if you look at those numbers, the church leaders are encouraging people to get retested by the end of the week. To see 64% of them as of sort of early this morning, that's a good and encouraging sign that they are doing that.
I'll ask you about an Australian claim that New Zealand is spending $8 million per life saved.
I'd have to figure out what the basis of that claim was.
Strange to try and monetize what someone's life is worth.
Yeah, and generally it's not something that we would do. We don't put a dollar value on people's lives.
the underlying statement there is: is it costing us too much to be in lockdown, which is saving people's lives?
Look, you look at what's happening around other countries around the world, and to look at the thousands of deaths that New Zealand would experience, thousands if not tens of thousands of deaths that New Zealand would experience if we took a different approach. That's not a price that I am willing to pay, and that's not a monetary price. That's a price in terms of human lives, and I think that what we're doing is the right thing. Last question up there.
If the Ministry of Health is comparing the genome sequencing of Dr. Joe Williams and his brother who died also of COVID, I think the day earlier in Australia, I mean, obviously two different countries, but is there any links there that are being explored?
We certainly genome sequencing most cases now. Where we don't genome sequence, sometimes we won't, if there's 3 or 4 cases in a household, we won't sequence every one of them. We'll sequence one out of the household to identify and then presume the rest of them are the same, which is a reasonable conclusion to make. And we do make international comparisons. Some countries have a much higher rate of genome sequencing than others. So we know the UK, for example, have one of the highest genome sequencing rates. And so we've got a good library, if you like, out of the UK to compare with. And Australia have done quite a lot in this space too. I don't know whether his brother has been genome sequenced, but I think it's unlikely there's been any chain of contact there, though, so it's probably not going to tell us very much, but we always look at these things.
Prime Minister, I appreciate you want to go, but just one final question. You've had this job now for a few weeks now, so have you given any thought to what you want to do if you are re-elected, if Labor comes back in? Would you want to keep both portfolios, or do you have a preference? Would you want to be either Education Minister or Health Minister? What's your thinking?
I love all my children equally. That's really a matter for the Prime Minister to determine after the election. Should we be in that fortunate position?
You don't have a preference?
Not one that I'm going to share today. Thanks, everybody.